Black girl says the bus driver did it again. Dad calls 911 immediately. The sound of desperate footsteps echoed through the unfamiliar streets as 8-year-old Lisa Johnson ran, tears streaming down her face. Her yellow dress was dirty, her braids disheveled, and her heart pounding against her chest. The setting sun cast long shadows across the empty suburban sidewalks, making everything look alien and threatening. Miles away, Nina Johnson's trembling fingers dialed 911, her voice cracking with panic. My daughter. She never came home from school. Red and blue lights flashed outside their window as Malcolm's car screeched into the driveway. He burst through the door, his tie loosened and face etched with fear. The bus driver did it again, Lisa would later whisper, unlocking a dark secret that had been festering in their seemingly perfect suburban community, a secret that would change everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The moving truck rumbled away from the modest 2-story house, leaving the Johnson family standing on their freshly mowed lawn. Nina squeezed Lisa's small hand, watching her 8-year-old daughter take in their new surroundings with wide, curious eyes. The prestigious suburban neighborhood, with its manicured gardens and elegant homes, represented everything they'd worked so hard for. Malcolm adjusted his designer tie, a symbol of his recent promotion that had brought them here. As the only black family in the neighborhood, they knew there would be challenges, but the opportunity, better schools, safer streets, and a chance for Lisa to have the best possible future seemed worth it. Can we put a swing on that tree, Mommy? Lisa asked, pointing to a towering oak in their front yard. Her dark curls bounced with excitement, and Nina felt a flutter of hope. Maybe the transition wouldn't be as difficult as she'd feared. Nina's home office, a bright space overlooking the backyard, would allow her to continue her successful career as a graphic designer while being there for Lisa. The previous month's award-winning campaign had caught the attention of several high-profile clients, and working remotely meant she could finally achieve the work-life balance she'd always wanted. The neighbors emerged from their homes like curious birds, some offering tight-lipped smiles, others quickly retreating behind closed doors. Sarah Matthews, from 2 houses down, approached with a plate of cookies and a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to Oak Grove," she said, her gaze flicking between them. "We're quite traditional here." The warning in her words wasn't lost on Nina, but she accepted the cookies with grace. Malcolm's hand found the small of her back, a gentle reminder that they were in this together. The next morning, as they waited for the school bus, Mr. Miller's arrival cast a subtle shadow over their hope. The elderly driver's welcoming smile froze for a fraction of a second when he saw Lisa so briefly that Nina almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. Almost. Good morning," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You must be new to the route." His pale blue eyes lingered on Lisa a moment too long before he turned away. As the days passed, small incidents began to accumulate like grains of sand, the way other parents would usher their children away when Nina approached, the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when Malcolm walked by, the growing tension in Lisa's shoulders every morning as the bus approached. The neighborhood's pristine facade began to crack, revealing glimpses of something darker beneath. During the local committee meeting, Nina noticed how Sarah Matthews commanded attention, her influence over the community evident in the way others deferred to her opinions. "We've never had any problems here," Sarah declared during a discussion about school transportation. "No need to fix what isn't broken." But something was broken. Nina saw it in the way Lisa's vibrant personality began to dim like a flower wilting in shade. Malcolm immersed himself in his new position at the law firm, working longer hours perhaps to prove himself worthy of the opportunity. The pressure to succeed, to justify their presence in this space, weighed heavily on all of them. At night, lying awake in their new master bedroom, Nina would listen to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the house, wondering if they'd made the right decision. The prestigious address and excellent school district had seemed like a dream come true, but dreams, she was learning, could sometimes hide nightmares. Their presence had disturbed the carefully maintained equilibrium of Oak Grove, and the ripples of change were spreading. Some neighbors, like young Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street, would offer genuine smiles and quiet words of support. Others, led by Sarah Matthews, maintained a polite but impenetrable wall of exclusion. Mr. Miller, with his grandfatherly appearance and long-standing position in the community, seemed above reproach. His reputation, built over decades of service, was untouchable. But something in his pale eyes, in the way they followed Lisa's movements, sent chills down Nina's spine. "We need to give it time," Malcolm would say, straightening his tie before heading to the office. Things will settle down, but Nina wasn't so sure. In the quiet moments of their new life, she could feel something building, like storm clouds gathering on a summer horizon. Their beautiful new home, their fresh start, their dreams of a better future, all of it balanced on a knife's edge of acceptance and rejection. And Lisa, their bright, beautiful Lisa, stood at the center of it all, unknowingly carrying the weight of their hopes and fears onto that yellow bus every morning, under the watchful eyes of Mr. Miller and a community that had yet to decide if it would embrace or reject them. Lisa's first day on the school bus dawned bright and crisp, her new backpack clutched tightly against her chest as she waited at the curb. Nina straightened her daughter's collar for the 10th time, fighting back her own anxiety as the yellow bus approached. Mr. Miller's weathered face appeared in the doorway, his smile practiced and hollow. "Welcome aboard, young lady," he said, his tone carrying an undercurrent that made Nina's maternal instincts flare. As Lisa climbed the steps, Mr. Miller's voice dropped to a murmur. "We do things a certain way here. I trust you'll learn quickly." Through the bus windows, Nina watched as the other children shifted in their seats, some turning away, others staring openly. Lisa stood in the aisle for a moment, uncertainty written across her face, before sliding into an empty seat near the back. The bus pulled away, leaving Nina with an inexplicable sense of dread. The changes were subtle at first. Lisa's animated stories about school grew shorter, her responses more guarded. She began taking longer to gather her things in the morning, her movements deliberately slow, as if trying to delay the inevitable bus ride. One morning, Nina overheard Mr. Miller speaking to Lisa as she boarded. "Your kind usually sits in the back," he said, just loud enough for Lisa to hear but too quiet for anyone else to notice. "It's traditional." When Nina brought her concerns to Malcolm that evening, his response was frustratingly practical. "We can't jump at shadows, Nina," he said, loosening his tie after another long day at the firm. "Mr. Miller's been driving these routes for decades. We need to be careful about making accusations." "But Lisa's different now," Nina insisted, watching their daughter push food around her plate at dinner. "She's withdrawing, Malcolm. Something's wrong." "Everything's different now," Malcolm countered. "New house, new school, new neighborhood. She just needs time to adjust. We all do." The first confrontation with their neighbors came unexpectedly. At a PTA meeting, Nina raised questions about the bus routes and supervision. Sarah Matthews' voice cut through the room like ice. "We've never had any problems with our transportation system," she announced, other parents nodding in agreement. Perhaps if certain people focused more on adapting to our community rather than trying to change it. The implication hung in the air, heavy and hostile. Nina felt the weight of every stare, the judgment in every whispered conversation. That night she found Lisa crying in her room, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. "Baby, what's wrong?" Nina asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Did something happen on the bus today?" Lisa wiped her eyes quickly, forcing a smile that broke Nina's heart. "I'm fine, Mommy. Just tired," but the slight tremor in her voice told a different story. Each morning became a battle of wills. Lisa's footsteps would drag more heavily toward the bus, while Mr. Miller's smiles grew colder, his comments more pointed. "You're lucky to be here," he would say, "or some people should know their place." The microaggressions piled up like autumn leaves, impossible to ignore but difficult to prove. Nina began documenting everything: dates, times, comments in a small notebook she kept in her desk drawer. Malcolm's dismissal of her concerns created the first real tension in their marriage, a crack in their united front. "You're being paranoid," he snapped one evening after Nina suggested they find alternative transportation for Lisa. "Do you know how it would look if we complained? I've worked too hard to get us here, Nina. We can't rock the boat." But watching her daughter's spirit dim day by day, Nina knew they were past the point of keeping the peace. Something had to give, and soon. The perfect suburban dream they'd chased was revealing itself to be a carefully constructed facade, hiding deeper, uglier truths beneath its manicured surface. Nina woke to the sound of muffled sobs coming from Lisa's room. It was the third time this week. Padding quietly down the hallway, she found her daughter tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, tears streaming down her face. "He was chasing me," Mommy, Lisa whimpered. "Mr. Miller. He left me somewhere dark, and I couldn't find my way home." The nightmares had started gradually, but were now a regular occurrence. During the day, Lisa would put on a brave face, but the dark circles under her eyes told the true story of her sleepless nights. While dropping off some design work at a local print shop, Nina noticed Mrs. Rodriguez, one of the few other minority parents in the neighborhood, hurriedly ushering her children into her car. "We don't take the bus anymore," she whispered when Nina approached. "It's safer this way." Before Nina could press further, Mrs. Rodriguez drove away, leaving behind only a worried glance and an unspoken warning. At work, Malcolm faced his own battles. The prestigious law firm that had seemed so welcoming during interviews now revealed its true colors. His cases were scrutinized more heavily than his colleagues', his decisions questioned at every turn. "They're watching me fail," he confided to Nina late one night, "waiting for me to prove I don't belong here." The monthly community meeting at Oak Grove Civic Center became a turning point. Nina sat rigid in her plastic chair as Sarah Matthews dominated the discussion about school transportation safety. "Our system has worked perfectly for generations," Sarah declared, her pearl necklace catching the fluorescent light. "We don't need outside influences suggesting changes." Several parents nodded in agreement, but Nina couldn't stay silent any longer. She stood, her heart pounding. "My daughter comes home crying. Other families are avoiding the bus entirely. How is that a perfect system?" The room erupted in murmurs. Sarah's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Perhaps," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "if certain families spent more time teaching their children proper behavior instead of making accusations." Proper behavior, Nina's voice rose. Like accepting discrimination. Like staying quiet when someone hurts them. Malcolm, sitting beside her, tugged at her sleeve. "Nina, please," he whispered, "not here." But Sarah was already advancing, her perfectly manicured finger pointing accusingly. "How dare you come into our community and cause trouble? Mr. Miller has served this neighborhood faithfully for 30 years. He's like family to us. Who are you to question his character?" The confrontation spilled into the parking lot, where Sarah's true colors emerged fully. "We all know why you're really here," she hissed, her facade of civility cracking. "Taking advantage of our good schools, our safe streets. But you don't belong here, you never will." That night, the tension between Nina and Malcolm reached a breaking point. "You humiliated me," he shouted. "Do you know how this looks? My wife causing scenes at community meetings while I'm trying to establish myself at the firm. Our daughter is suffering," Malcolm, Nina shot back. "But you're too busy playing their game to notice. Did you know Lisa's having nightmares? Did you know she stopped eating lunch at school?" Malcolm's anger deflated slightly. "Of course I've noticed," he said quietly, "but we have to be strategic about this. One wrong move, and everything we've worked for could disappear." "Maybe it should," Nina whispered. "Maybe the cost is too high." The next day, Nina noticed other subtle changes she'd missed before. The way certain parents pulled their children away when Lisa approached the playground. The whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the grocery store. The anonymous note in their mailbox suggesting they'd be happier somewhere else. But it was Lisa's art project that truly broke Nina's heart. The assignment was to draw their daily routine, and Lisa's picture showed herself sitting alone at the back of the bus, tears in her eyes while Mr. Miller loomed large in the front, his face twisted into an exaggerated frown. When Nina showed the drawing to Malcolm, she finally saw real fear replace his practiced optimism. "Maybe you're right," he admitted, staring at their daughter's cry for help rendered in crayon. "Maybe we've been blind to what's really happening." The perfect suburban dream they'd chased was crumbling, revealing the nightmare beneath. Their beautiful house, Malcolm's prestigious job, the promising future they'd imagined, all of it seemed to be built on a foundation of sand, eroding more each day under the relentless tide of prejudice and silent hostility. As they lay in bed that night, listening to Lisa's quiet whimpers from down the hall, Nina and Malcolm finally faced the truth they'd been avoiding. They weren't just fighting one prejudiced bus driver. They were up against an entire system designed to break them. Nina began her investigation carefully, methodically. Each morning she parked her car a block away from the bus stop, watching through tinted windows as Mr. Miller's bus made its rounds. She noted how Lisa was always directed to the back, how other minority children were treated with the same subtle disdain, how some stops were mysteriously skipped when certain children waited there. Lisa's grades began to slip. Her once pristine homework now came back marked with red, her teacher's notes growing increasingly concerned. "Lisa seems distracted in class," they wrote. "She's having trouble concentrating." During parent-teacher conferences, Nina noticed how the teacher's eyes slid away when she mentioned the bus situation, as if afraid to acknowledge the elephant in the room. At the law firm, Malcolm's position grew more precarious. His senior partner called him in for a friendly chat about community relations. "We've heard some," concerns, the partner said, leather chair creaking as he leaned back. "About your wife stirring up trouble. That's not the kind of attention we want at this firm, Malcolm." Malcolm's hands clenched in his lap. "My wife is protecting our daughter," he said quietly. Of course, the partner waved dismissively. "But perhaps there are more. Appropriate ways to handle these situations. Ways that don't reflect poorly on the firm." The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Nina was reviewing her surveillance notes when Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on her door, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I found something," she whispered, pressing a crumpled envelope into Nina's hands. "My Carmen, she was a victim too. Last year we were too afraid to speak up, but..." Inside the envelope was a series of diary entries detailing Carmen Rodriguez's own experiences with Mr. Miller. The pattern was identical: subtle threats, accidental drop-offs in wrong locations, psychological warfare designed to break young spirits. Nina's investigation deepened. She discovered other families who had moved away suddenly, their departures marked by whispered rumors and knowing looks. She found old complaints buried in school board records, each one dismissed or explained away. The system wasn't just broken, it was deliberately designed to protect people like Mr. Miller. The community tension reached a boiling point when Nina started asking questions about a security camera installed on the bus last year, a camera that had mysteriously malfunctioned during crucial incidents. Sarah Matthews organized an emergency neighborhood meeting, her voice shrill with barely contained rage. "These accusations are destroying our community," she declared to the packed room. "These people move in demanding changes to systems that have worked perfectly for decades. They're trying to tear down everything we've built." But this time Nina was prepared. She stood calmly, holding up Mrs. Rodriguez's evidence. "Is this what you call working perfectly?" she asked, her voice steady. "Children terrorized? Families driven away? How many victims have you silenced, Sarah?" A young mother in the back row stood up hesitantly. My Jeremy, he said something last month about Mr. Miller. I didn't want to believe it, but her voice trailed off as Sarah's icy glare turned her way. The cracks in the facade were spreading. Another parent spoke up, then another. Stories that had been buried for years began to surface. Mr. Miller's carefully cultivated grandfather image began to crumble as the truth emerged, a pattern of targeted harassment spanning decades, protected by a community too invested in its own perfection to acknowledge the rot at its core. Then came the security footage. Despite claims of malfunction, Nina's persistent digging revealed that copies had been preserved. The video showed Mr. Miller's true nature, the subtle threats, the accidental misstops, the way he isolated vulnerable children. Nothing overtly criminal, but a clear pattern of psychological abuse designed to break young spirits. Malcolm's firm instructed him to distance himself from the growing scandal. Think about your career, his partner warned. But watching the footage of his daughter's torment, Malcolm finally found his voice. I am thinking about what matters, he said, placing his resignation letter on the partner's desk. The pressure on the Johnson family intensified. Anonymous threats appeared in their mailbox. Their car was vandalized. Signs appeared on their lawn telling them to go back where you came from, but they weren't alone anymore. Other families began to stand with them, forming a network of support that transcended racial lines. Lisa's struggles continued, but something was changing in her too. Watching her parents fight for justice, she began to find her own courage. In her therapy sessions, she started opening up about her experiences, her voice growing stronger as she realized she wasn't to blame. As the evidence mounted and more victims came forward, Nina realized they were uncovering something bigger than one prejudiced bus driver. They were exposing a system of silence and complicity that had allowed abuse to flourish under the guise of tradition and respectability. The perfect suburban facade was cracking, and through those cracks, the truth was finally beginning to emerge. It would get worse before it got better, but for the first time since moving to Oak Grove, Nina felt something she hadn't expected: hope. Not just for Lisa, but for every child who had ever been silenced by fear and prejudice. The storm was coming, and this time they were ready to face it head-on. The first time Mr. Miller abandoned Lisa, the autumn sun was already setting, casting long shadows across unfamiliar streets. Instead of her usual stop, he had let her off in an industrial area miles from home, his cold smile reflected in the rearview mirror as the bus doors hissed shut. Sometimes children need to learn the hard way, he had said, before pulling away and leaving her alone. Lisa walked for hours, terrified and confused, while Nina and Malcolm frantically called the police, the school, anyone who might help. When she finally made it home, guided by a kind stranger who recognized a lost child in distress, the family's worst fears were confirmed. We have to do something, Nina insisted that night, pacing their living room while Lisa slept fitfully upstairs. This is assault. This is child endangerment. We can't let him get away with this. Malcolm ran his hands over his face, his law firm's warnings echoing in his mind. We need to be smart about this, he said. If we go to the police without concrete evidence, it's our word against his. And you know whose side this community will take. Their argument escalated, voices rising despite attempts to keep quiet for Lisa's sake. So we just wait until something worse happens, Nina demanded. Until he hurts her in a way we can't ignore. That's not what I'm saying, Malcolm shot back. But we need to think about the consequences. My job, our mortgage, Lisa's future. Lisa's future, Nina's laugh was bitter. What future are we giving her if we teach her to stay quiet when someone hurts her? The police response was exactly as Malcolm had predicted. The officer took their statement with barely concealed skepticism, his pen moving lazily across the notepad. Mr. Miller says Lisa requested to be let off at that stop, he said. Says she was meeting a friend. No evidence of wrongdoing here. She's 8 years old, Nina's voice cracked with frustration. What 8-year-old asks to be left in an industrial park? The officer shrugged. Maybe there was a miscommunication. Mr. Miller's been driving these routes for 30 years. Never had a complaint before. But they both knew that wasn't true. Nina had the evidence, the pattern of buried complaints, the testimonies of other families. Yet every time she tried to present it, doors slammed shut. The school board refused to meet with her. The local paper declined to investigate. Even their neighbors who had privately expressed support now crossed the street to avoid them. The community's reaction was swift and brutal. Led by Sarah Matthews, a campaign of subtle harassment began. Property values were suddenly a common topic at PTA meetings, with pointed comments about certain elements bringing down the neighborhood. Anonymous letters appeared in their mailbox suggesting they'd be happier somewhere else. Lisa withdrew further into herself, her nightmares growing more frequent. One night, Nina found her sitting in the dark, clutching her backpack. "I don't want to ride the bus anymore, Mommy," she whispered. "Please don't make me." The weight of helplessness crushed Nina's chest. They had bought into the American dream: good neighborhood, good schools, good opportunities. Instead, they had stumbled into a nightmare of institutional racism and systemic abuse, where even their attempts to protect their child were painted as troublemaking. Malcolm started driving Lisa to school himself, despite the strain it put on his work schedule. But the harm was already done. Their daughter's trust in authority in the system meant to protect her was shattered. The psychological damage of being targeted, disbelieved, and dismissed had left its mark. Nina's depression deepened as she watched her family suffer. The guilt of having pushed for this move, of having put Lisa in harm's way, ate at her. Malcolm's long hours at the firm, his desperate attempt to maintain their foothold in this hostile community, created a growing distance between them. The perfect life they had dreamed of was crumbling, and the worst part was knowing that speaking up had only made things worse. But staying silent was no longer an option. Something had to break, either the system that protected abusers like Mr. Miller or their own spirits. As Nina watched Lisa slowly getting ready for another school day, she made a silent vow: they would not be broken. They would not be driven out. No matter what it took, they would find a way to protect their daughter and expose the truth. The real question was, at what cost? The true tragedy struck on a rain-soaked Wednesday afternoon. Nina was following up on another lead about Mr. Miller's past when she noticed an unfamiliar car trailing her. Her heart raced as she turned down side streets, trying to lose her pursuer. The car stayed close, its headlights glaring in her rearview mirror. When she finally pulled into a church parking lot, seeking sanctuary, two men emerged from the vehicle. Nina recognized them as members of the school board. "You need to stop digging," one said, his voice low and threatening. "Some things are better left buried." The confrontation turned physical. As Nina tried to reach her car, one of the men grabbed her arm. She struggled, crying out for help, when suddenly the church doors opened. Father Michael, the local priest, emerged, his voice cutting through the rain. "The Lord sees all," he called out firmly, "even what men try to hide in darkness." The men retreated, but the message was clear. That evening, as Nina sat in the emergency room with a sprained wrist and bruised ribs, Malcolm received the call they'd been dreading. His firm was letting him go, restructuring, they called it. They both knew the real reason. Lisa found her mother crying in the kitchen that night, hands clasped in prayer. "Mommy," she whispered, her small face etched with concern. "Are we going to be okay?" Nina pulled her daughter close, wincing at the pain in her ribs. "God doesn't give us more than we can handle," she whispered, remembering her own mother's words. "We just have to be strong enough to trust His plan." But their faith was tested further. The bank called about their mortgage payments. Insurance claims were mysteriously denied. Their neighbor's silence became deafening. The campaign to drive them out was working. They were running out of money, out of options, out of hope. One Sunday morning, as they sat in the back pew of St. Michael's Church, Nina noticed Lisa drawing in her prayer journal. The page showed their family holding hands surrounded by angels. "They're protecting us," Lisa explained. "Like Father Michael protected you." Malcolm, who had always been more practical than spiritual, found himself joining them in prayer more often. "I used to think faith was about accepting things," he confessed one evening. "Now I realize it's about finding the strength to change them." The harassment intensified. Their car's tires were slashed. Graffiti appeared on their garage door, ugly words that made Lisa cry and Nina's blood boil. Each time they reported it. Each time nothing was done. The police suggested they were oversensitive or imagining things. Father Michael became their unexpected ally, offering both spiritual guidance and practical support. Christ didn't stay silent in the face of injustice, he reminded them during a counseling session. Sometimes faith requires us to stand up and speak truth to power. The breaking point came when Lisa collapsed at school from anxiety. The doctor diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder, recommending immediate removal from the hostile environment. As they sat by their daughter's hospital bed, Nina and Malcolm faced the hardest decision of their lives. "Maybe we should leave," Malcolm suggested, his voice hollow. "Start fresh somewhere else. Isn't that what God's telling us?" Nina watched Lisa sleeping, her face finally peaceful under the fluorescent lights. "No," she said firmly. "God brought us here for a reason, not to run away, but to fight, to change things, for Lisa and for every child who comes after her." That night they prayed together as a family for the first time since moving to Oak Grove. They prayed not for escape, but for strength, not for peace, but for justice, not for acceptance, but for the courage to stand against what was wrong. As they left the hospital, they found Father Michael waiting in the lobby. "The church stands with you," he said simply. "Whatever comes next, you're not alone." Nina squeezed Malcolm's hand, feeling Lisa's small fingers intertwined with hers. They had lost their home, their jobs, their sense of security. But in the depths of their tragedy, they had found something stronger, an unshakable faith in each other, in justice, and in the God who had brought them this far. They didn't know it yet, but their darkest hour was about to give way to dawn. Sometimes, Nina would later reflect, God's greatest miracles come disguised as our greatest challenges. The truth was about to break through the darkness, but first they had to lose everything to find their true strength. The first ray of hope came from the most unexpected source. Sarah Matthews' daughter, Emily, appeared at their door one rainy evening, trembling and tearful. Behind her stood Sarah herself, her usual confident demeanor replaced by something Nina had never seen before: shame. "Tell them," Sarah whispered to her daughter, her voice breaking. "Tell them what you told me." Emily's story poured out in broken sobs. 2 years ago, when she was Lisa's age, Mr. Miller had done the same thing to her. The isolation, the threats, the accidental drop-offs in strange places. Sarah had dismissed her daughter's claims, choosing to believe in the community's perfect facade rather than her own child's truth. "I found her diary yesterday," Sarah said, hands shaking as she handed Nina a worn notebook. "All this time I was protecting the wrong people. I was wrong. So terribly wrong." The diary contained detailed accounts of Emily's experiences, dates, locations, conversations, all meticulously documented by a frightened child who thought no one would believe her. But more than that, it contained names of other victims. Other families who had moved away quietly, their stories buried under the weight of community pressure. Within days, the floodgates opened. Mrs. Rodriguez came forward with security camera footage she'd secretly recorded from her house, showing Mr. Miller's bus making unauthorized stops. A former school board member, racked with guilt, provided documents showing years of buried complaints. The police could no longer ignore the evidence. Detective Brooks, who had initially dismissed their complaints, now sat in their living room, apologizing as she reviewed the mounting evidence. "We should have listened sooner," she admitted. "This goes deeper than we thought." The investigation revealed decades of systematic cover-ups. Mr. Miller's personnel file contained multiple red flags that had been deliberately overlooked. School board meetings where complaints were raised had mysteriously missing minutes. Families who had tried to speak up had been silenced through various forms of community pressure. But the most shocking revelation came from Sarah herself. The neighborhood association she confessed during a formal police interview. "We were told our property values would plummet if word got out. We chose our investments over our children's safety. I can't live with that anymore." The community's carefully maintained image cracked wide open. Local news stations camped outside the school board offices. Parents who had once crossed the street to avoid Nina now approached with their own stories, their own apologies, their own shame. Father Michael opened the church for a community meeting, not to bury the truth this time, but to face it. The pews were packed as family after family after family stood to share their experiences. Lisa, holding tightly to Nina's hand, watched as her silence transformed into a chorus of voices demanding change. Emily and Lisa, once divided by their parents' prejudices, sat together during the meeting, their shared trauma creating a bond that transcended the community's artificial barriers. "We're not alone anymore," Lisa whispered to her new friend, and Nina felt tears spring to her eyes. Malcolm, who had started attending local legal aid clinics to help other families fight systemic discrimination, found his true calling in the midst of their struggle. His former firm's attempts to silence him had only given him a louder voice and a clearer purpose. The perfect facade of Oak Grove had shattered, but from its ruins something more authentic was emerging. Something built not on silence and exclusion, but on truth and reconciliation. The road ahead would be long, but they were no longer walking it alone. The second time Mr. Miller abandoned Lisa, he didn't expect the community's response. When Lisa didn't return home that afternoon, Nina immediately called the police, but this time Sarah Matthews was the first to organize a search party. Dozens of neighbors, many who had once shunned them, now combed the streets calling Lisa's name. "He took a different route today," Emily told the police, her voice shaking. "I saw him turn left instead of right. He does that when she couldn't finish the sentence, but her mother pulled her close, encouraging her to continue. When he wants to scare someone really badly." The police found Mr. Miller's empty bus parked near the old industrial district. On board, Lisa's backpack lay abandoned in the back seat, a silent testimony to his final act of cruelty. But this time he had underestimated the strength of a united community. Lisa was discovered walking along the railroad tracks, her yellow dress dirty but her spirit unbroken. "I knew you'd find me this time," she said as Nina wrapped her in a fierce embrace. "I knew I wasn't alone anymore." Mr. Miller was arrested trying to board a bus out of town. As the police led him away in handcuffs, the mask of grandfatherly kindness finally slipped, revealing the anger and hatred beneath. "You people ruined everything," he spat at Nina. "This community was perfect before you came." The courthouse was packed for his arraignment. Families from across the district filled the benches, their presence a silent rebuke to decades of enforced silence. Malcolm, having found his voice as an advocate for civil rights, stood as co-counsel for the prosecution. "This case is about more than one man's actions," he told the hushed courtroom. "It's about a system that protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. It's about the choice we make between comfortable lies and difficult truths." The evidence was overwhelming. Sarah Matthews testified about the neighborhood association's role in suppressing complaints. School board members admitted to destroying records. Former victims, now adults, spoke about the long-lasting impact of Mr. Miller's abuse. But it was Lisa's testimony that brought the courtroom to tears. Standing brave and tall despite her fear, she detailed every incident, every threat, every moment of terror. "I want other kids to know they can speak up," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I want them to know someone will believe them." Mr. Miller's defense attempted to paint him as a product of his time, a dedicated civil servant being sacrificed to changing social standards. But the security footage, the documented pattern of abuse, and the testimonies of countless families told a different story. The media coverage was intense. National news outlets picked up the story, recognizing it as a symbol of bigger issues: systemic racism, institutional corruption, the power of community action. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their signs demanding justice not just for Lisa but for every child who had ever been silenced. During a particularly tense day of testimony, Nina noticed something remarkable. The courtroom seating, once informally segregated, now showed a different pattern. Black and white families sat together, united in their determination to see justice done. Children who had once been taught to fear each other now played together in the courthouse corridors. Emily took the stand after Lisa, describing her own experiences and her mother's initial disbelief. Sarah sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as her daughter spoke her truth. The wall of silence that had protected Mr. Miller for so long was crumbling brick by brick. Father Michael provided powerful testimony about the church's role both in initially maintaining silence and now in fostering healing. Our greatest sin, he declared, was choosing comfort over justice. We cannot make that mistake again. As the trial progressed, Oak Grove began to transform. The neighborhood association, under new leadership, implemented anti-discrimination policies. The school board underwent a complete overhaul. Most importantly, people began to talk openly about the past, acknowledging the pain while working toward a better future. The prosecution's closing arguments emphasized the broader implications of the case. Today, we're not just judging one man's actions, Malcolm stated. We're deciding what kind of community we want to be. One that buries its sins under a perfect facade, or one that faces its failures and grows stronger from them. The verdict, when it came, felt like a collective exhalation of held breath. Guilty on all counts. But for the Johnson family and their newfound allies, it was more than a legal victory. It was validation of their struggle, proof that speaking truth to power could create real change. As they left the courthouse that day, Lisa noticed a rainbow breaking through the clouds. "Look, Mommy," she said, pointing upward. "Everything's going to be different now, isn't it?" Nina squeezed her daughter's hand, looking at the diverse group of supporters surrounding them. "Yes, baby," she replied. "Everything already is." The second bombshell dropped during the sentencing phase when a retired administrator from Mr. Miller's previous school district came forward. Clutching a manila envelope, his hands trembling, he revealed decades of buried complaints spanning 3 different school systems. Mr. Miller had been quietly transferred each time allegations surfaced, his record wiped clean through a network of complicit administrators. "We thought we were protecting the school's reputation," the administrator confessed, his voice heavy with regret. "Instead, we were enabling a predator to continue targeting vulnerable children. The pattern was always the same: minority students, children from struggling families, anyone he thought wouldn't be believed." The revelation sparked a broader investigation. Local journalists, emboldened by the community's transformation, uncovered a systematic pattern of cover-ups. School board members had received promotions and perks in exchange for their silence. Property developers had pressured the neighborhood association to maintain the area's desirable demographics through subtle intimidation. Sarah Matthews, continuing her journey from antagonist to ally, revealed the full extent of the neighborhood association's involvement. "We had a coded system," she testified, her voice steady despite her shame. "Ways to discourage certain families from moving in, methods to pressure others to leave. All to maintain our perfect image, our property values, our privilege." The most stunning revelation came from Mr. Miller himself. Facing life imprisonment and confronted with the weight of evidence, he agreed to a full confession. His carefully cultivated grandfather persona crumbled as he detailed decades of calculated abuse, revealing a dark network of enablers and protectors. Lisa watched from the courtroom as the man who had terrorized her was finally stripped of his power. "He looks so small now," she whispered to Nina. "He's not scary anymore." The case triggered a domino effect across the state. Other communities began examining their own practices, their own silences. Civil rights organizations launched investigations into similar patterns of institutional discrimination. What had started as one family's fight for justice had become a catalyst for systemic change. Emily and Lisa, once divided by their parents' prejudices, became symbols of healing and reconciliation. Their friendship, forged in shared trauma, showed the community a path forward. Together, they started a support group for other children affected by discrimination and abuse, turning their pain into purpose. Malcolm's resignation from his prestigious law firm no longer felt like a sacrifice, but a liberation. He partnered with civil rights organizations, using his experience to help other families fight systemic discrimination. The firm that had once tried to silence him now watched as he became a leading voice for change. Father Michael opened the church for regular community dialogues, creating a safe space for difficult conversations about race, privilege, and responsibility. The pews filled with people of all backgrounds, united in their commitment to building a truly inclusive community. As Oak Grove's carefully maintained facade crumbled, a more authentic and vibrant community emerged from its ruins. Property values didn't plummet as feared. Instead, families were drawn to the area's commitment to justice and inclusion. The perfect suburban dream had been replaced by something more valuable: genuine human connection and shared purpose. 5 years after Mr. Miller's conviction, Oak Grove had transformed beyond recognition. The Johnson family stood on their front porch, watching as children of all backgrounds played together in their yard, the sound of laughter filling the air that once held so much tension. Lisa, now 13, sat on the porch swing with Emily Matthews, the two girls inseparable despite their family's complicated history. They were working on a presentation for the community youth council they had founded, aimed at teaching younger children about standing up to discrimination and bullying. "Remember when we were afraid to even talk to each other?" Emily asked, sketching ideas in her notebook. Lisa nodded, her eyes reflecting wisdom beyond her years. "Now look at us, best friends changing the world." Nina watched from the kitchen window as Sarah Matthews approached their house, carrying her signature apple pie. Their weekly coffee meetings had become a symbol of Oak Grove's transformation. The two women who had once been bitter opponents now led the community's diversity and inclusion committee together. "Sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed," Sarah said, settling at the kitchen table. "I was so wrong, Nina." About everything, Nina squeezed her friend's hand. "We all had to learn and grow. The important thing is that we did." Malcolm's new civil rights law practice had become a beacon of hope for families facing discrimination across the state. The prestigious firm that had once fired him now regularly referred cases to him, acknowledging his expertise in fighting systemic injustice. His office walls were covered with thank you letters from families he had helped, each one a reminder of why their fight had been worth it. The school system had undergone a complete overhaul. Security cameras on buses were now standard, with regular monitoring and transparent reporting systems. The school board, once a bastion of privilege and secrecy, now reflected the diverse community it served. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had helped expose Mr. Miller's crimes, served as its chairperson. Father Michael's church had become a true community center, hosting interfaith dialogues, cultural celebrations, and support groups for families dealing with trauma and discrimination. The Sunday services were a vibrant mix of faces and voices, the segregated seating of the past replaced by genuine fellowship. The neighborhood association, under Sarah's leadership, had transformed from an instrument of exclusion to a force for positive change. Property values had indeed risen, not because of artificial restrictions, but because Oak Grove had become known as a model of successful integration and community healing. Lisa's trauma counseling group, which she co-led with Emily, had helped dozens of children process their experiences and find their voices. The two girls had been invited to speak at schools across the state, sharing their story of friendship overcoming prejudice. "Tell us again about the day everything changed," the younger children would ask, gathering around Lisa and Emily during their presentations. The girls would share their story, not to dwell on the pain, but to show how speaking truth to power could create real change. The annual Oak Grove Community Festival, once an exercise in artificial perfection, had become a genuine celebration of diversity. Food stalls featuring cuisines from around the world lined the streets, while cultural performances showcased the rich heritage of its residents. The highlight was always the Unity Walk, led by Lisa and Emily, commemorating their journey from victims to advocates. Nina's design business had flourished, specializing in creating inclusive marketing campaigns that celebrated diversity. Her clients now included civil rights organizations and community groups working for social justice. The awards on her office wall were meaningful not just for their professional recognition, but for their impact on changing societal narratives. Malcolm's law practice had expanded to include a mentorship program for young minority lawyers, breaking down the barriers he had faced in his own career. The conference room that had once heard his termination now hosted strategy sessions for civil rights cases, filled with diverse voices and perspectives. The bus stop where Lisa had once stood in fear had been transformed into a memorial garden, with a plaque telling their story. "Courage grows here at Red," surrounded by flowers planted by community children. It served as both a reminder of the past and a symbol of hope for the future. One evening, as the family sat on their porch watching the sunset, Lisa asked, "Do you ever regret moving here, Mom, after everything that happened?" Nina looked at her daughter, now confident and strong, at the diverse group of children playing in their yard, at Sarah and Emily Matthews walking up their driveway with dessert for their weekly dinner together. She thought about the changes they had sparked, the lives they had touched, the community they had helped build. "No, sweetheart," she replied, "sometimes the hardest journeys lead us exactly where we need to be. We didn't just change a neighborhood, we helped create a template for what community can really mean." Malcolm wrapped his arm around his wife, watching his father Michael arrive for dinner, followed by Mrs. Rodriguez and other neighbors who had become like family. The perfect suburban dream they had originally chased had been replaced by something far more valuable, a genuine community built on truth, justice, and reconciliation. As the evening wound down, Lisa and Emily gathered the younger children to tell stories on the porch. Their voices carried across the lawn, strong and clear, sharing not just their past trauma, but their journey to healing and empowerment. The perfect facade of Oak Grove had cracked, but what grew through those cracks was something real and lasting, a community that had learned that true perfection lies not in maintaining appearances, but in facing truth and growing together. The sun set on Oak Grove, not on a neighborhood divided by fear and prejudice, but on a community united in its commitment to justice and inclusion. The Johnson family had lost their illusion of a perfect suburban dream, but they had gained something far more precious, a home where truth could be spoken, wounds could heal, and love could triumph over fear. In the depths of darkness, there lies a truth that can break even the hardest hearts. Our greatest pain often becomes our most powerful purpose. The Johnson family story isn't just about discrimination or injustice, it's a mirror reflecting our own struggles with silence and fear. When Lisa whispered the bus driver did it again, she wasn't just reporting an incident. She was speaking for every child who has ever felt small, scared, and silenced, for every parent who has had to choose between fighting for justice and protecting their family's security, for every person who has ever felt alone in a crowd, different in a sea of sameness. But the most heart-wrenching truth is that change often requires someone to be brave enough to bleed first. Nina and Malcolm had to watch their daughter suffer, their dreams shatter, and their security crumble before they could help build something beautiful from the ruins. It's in those moments of complete brokenness that we find our truest strength. Through Lisa's tears, we see our own children's vulnerabilities. Through Nina's sleepless nights, we feel every parent's deepest fears. Through Malcolm's struggle between career and conscience, we face our own moral crossroads. And through Sarah's transformation from antagonist to ally, we confront our own capacity for both prejudice and redemption. The most powerful message isn't in the victory, it's in the cost of getting there. It's in Lisa learning to trust again, Emily finding her voice through guilt and shame, in a community learning that real strength lies not in maintaining perfect facades, but in having the courage to shatter them when they hide injustice. Remember, every racist slur, every intimidating act, every moment of isolation was endured by a child who just wanted to go to school like everyone else. A child who had to grow up too fast, whose innocence was stolen by those meant to protect it. Yet through that pain, she taught an entire community how to be better, how to be human again. In the end, the story whispers to our souls, sometimes we must lose everything we thought we wanted to find everything we truly need. Our bruises become bridges, our scars become stories, and our pain becomes purpose. And perhaps that's the most beautiful, heartbreaking truth of all that. In our darkest moments, when we feel most alone, we're actually taking the first steps toward bringing light to others. This isn't just a story about winning against discrimination. It's about the price of silence, the cost of courage, and the profound truth that while justice may have a steep price, the cost of remaining silent is even higher. Through their pain, the Johnsons didn't just change a neighborhood, they showed us that real change begins when one person decides that love must speak louder than fear. And perhaps that's why we cry, not just for their pain, but for our own moments of silence, our own missed opportunities to stand up, our own fears of speaking truth to power. Their story reminds us that we all have a choice to remain comfortable in our silence, or to risk everything for what's right. In Lisa's words to the younger children years later, sometimes the scariest thing isn't what happens to you, it's choosing to speak up about it. But your voice might be the key that unlocks someone else's courage. And there lies the final, tear-inducing truth. Our deepest wounds, when exposed to the light of courage and love, don't just heal, they become lanterns guiding others home. If this story touched your heart, please help us spread its powerful message by subscribing, sharing with loved ones, and hitting that like button. Your comments fuel our passion to create more compelling stories that make a difference. Let us know in the comments if you'd like part 2. Every subscription and share helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Together, we can make a change.